Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Innsmouth, if I pronounced that correctly, and I also congratulate the Honourable Member for Dulwich and West Norwood for securing this debate, which was a pleasure, given the impact in Torquay, to be able to vote for it to happen as a member of the Backbench Business Committee. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to the Minister that I was obviously disappointed with the decision to close Torquay Magistrates Court for a number of reasons. As it be aware that it is something that has provided local justice for many years, and there were concerns raised by both the police and many others about the idea. It's not just the idea, as was touched on in the opening speech, of people answering charges who will now need to go elsewhere, but witnesses, victims and all others associated with the cases heard before a local magistrates court. It's also, for me, very important that a magistrates court has always been about local people sitting in judgment on local crimes and the matters that might irritate communities, rather than, let's say, a Crown Court where items can be more decided by the law overall, given their offences that, rightly, we want to have more deterrent sentences, and also where a judge would be more looking at the law and, as I said, was making sure precedents were correctly followed in terms of sentencing people for the crimes they have committed. I think for me what's been slightly concerning, and certainly as a member of the Public Accounts Committee when last week we were examining some of the value for money in the criminal justice system, was about what long-term plan there actually is for the court's estate. And what brings that really into focus in my own situation is the money that was spent over the last few years on Torquay Magistrates Court. Not least the £111,000 spent last year installing new windows in it. I accept the argument that people didn't wish to prejudge a closure decision, but it's quite clear we should have a long-term plan, and where a court might be one selected for closure, it's obvious that there needs to be really some restrictions on the amount of money being spent. You know, it is a welcome facility, but to see effectively £600,000 spent in the years before something's due to close, it is almost criminal waste of cash. And therefore, for me, whilst I welcome the fact that Torquay Magistrates Court is a good court and a good facility, I would say there does need to be a long-term asset plan for our courts estate to ensure that the investment that's now going to go into the wider network is targeted at those buildings in the best way possible, and that we don't find ourselves in a year or two's time debating buildings that had investment as part of this programme being proposed for closure as part of another programme. I think for me there is a wider discussion we had, other than just around bricks and mortar and buildings, about what type of cases are heard, and where, particularly in areas like will now be Torbay, without a magistrates court, what type of offences can be dealt with in alternative settings and alternative locations. I think for me there's many offences that we know are tried at magistrates court where the prospect of custody is next to nil, short of the person treating the court with contempt. And therefore I wish to see perhaps more of a strategy in a long-term plan about how to work with local authorities in particular who do have buildings that are suitable, council chambers, committee meeting rooms, that could be used for hearings where there is no prospect of custody. For example, those who fail to pay a TV licence, that actually it would be far more sensible for them not to be making a long journey, or also where there actually may be an argument around cases that have been irritating to a local community and actually would be benefit from being heard in them, rather than shipped away where, again, there isn't a prospect of custody being heard. I'd also think there is an allied discussion to be had around the courts about what items we do send to courts. One of the things I can remember during my time being in charge of finance at a local authority is, of course, council tax is one of the few debts that's still enforced via a threat of imprisonment. Now, I accept that it's almost unheard of for someone actually to be committed to prison purely for not paying their council tax. But as it stands today, you still have the whole process of collection of that tax going through a magistrates court, whereas every other debt that someone may owe to their local authority, apart from business rates, will be collected via the county court system. Remember us having to have two teams, one pursuing the same person for a debt that they owed perhaps our commercial refuse collection service, another person pursuing via the magistrates court collection of business rates. It's obviously different where people willfully set out to defraud the system, where they put a lie on a form, where they claim that they live on their own when they don't. That's clearly a matter of fraud and looking to defrauding the system that should be in the criminal courts. But I would perhaps encourage the government, as part of looking at reforming our court process, and also looking at what types of cases are ending up there, in particular perhaps the enforcement of council tax, which could be better done perhaps in a county court setting. Certainly in Torquay, that would mean people going to Torquay County Court rather than potentially setting off to a magistrates court to fundamentally have an argument about a debt they've been unable to pay. So for me, I think there is a real need focus for a long-term plan. Certainly I know the Public Accounts Committee will shortly be doing a report on following the examination we did on the NAO's report into the value for money in the criminal justice service. But I think for me, there is a real need to look at how we have a plan for the long-term future for our courts, how we have a strategy to ensure that some cases can still be decided locally, and a real commitment to doing that, not just an allusion to it, but a real firm plan in the areas where courts will no longer be the case and where there's no longer an alternative building in the very near vicinity. I'd also say it's also about how we have that for the magistracy as well, because certainly the news that Torquay Magistrates Court will disappear has prompted a number of people who sat on the bench for a long period of time to consider whether they would wish to travel to Plymouth to hear the large number of cases that will be there. And for me, I'd also be concerned if we rapidly found, as I touched on in intervention earlier, that our magistrates were actually all being drawn from areas close around where courts survived, rather than having, as people spread across the areas, able to reflect the impact of the communities concerned. And I think, and on a slightly related point, also about how we call people up for jury service as well. Whilst Crown Court cases are not held in Torbay, if we're reducing the number of potential Crown Court locations, we could be also similarly restricting the areas that we draw from, or can sensibly draw jurors from, and again making sure we have a real balance in terms of jurors appearing in the jury. It's meant to reflect the people as a whole. You can't do that on every jury, but people should have an equal chance of being pulled up for jury service, rather than finding that because they happen to live near to the sole Crown Court, their chances are very high, or higher, of being called for jury service, yet those who live some distance away, because of the practicalities of doing so, are not likely to be called at all for jury service. Again, that's one of the things I think would be interesting to look at in a long-term plan for our court service. So, whilst, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is disappointing to be standing here reflecting on the closure of Torquay Magistrates Court, and to again perhaps have the opportunity to express my disappointment about that, I do hope that some of the points will be taken up around more long-term planning to ensure we don't have things like large amounts of money being spent on courts months before they're proposed for closure, and also to have a real long-term think about exactly what's going before our courts, not just where those cases are heard. Thank you.